And then I'm also going to there we go. I'm gonna hit record. Turn my sound off. No, can't turn my sound off. Okay. So I'm gonna make you host again. And I am going to say that you can get started. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Okay. I need this.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. So my name is Leah Murray. I am the executive director of the Shelton McMurphy Johnson House in Eugene. And so I am talking today with Dr. Patrick Luedtke of the Public Health Department, and he is going to talk to us today about vaccinations and vaccine injuries. So if you could go ahead and get started, Patrick. I know you have a PowerPoint presentation for us today.
Very good. Thank you, Leah. Wonderful to join you today, and thanks to others who have joined as well. As Leah said, I'm Dr. Luedtke, and I work at the Lane County Department of Health and Human Services, your health department. And I'm going to talk about vaccines and vaccine effects, vaccine side effects, and some of the safety mechanisms we have. And then I'm going to finish with what I call the 5 most common questions that we get about vaccines at the health department. I suspect that maybe some of you have those same questions, but that's the plan for today. So what are vaccines? Vaccines are products that we take to teach our body's immune system to recognize and defend against germs, typically viruses and bacteria in humans, although there are other vaccines for parasites and such in animals. And most of us think of vaccines as a shot, an injection of some kind with a needle, and most of them are given that way. But we have vaccines that are also pills, they're liquids, they're nasal sprays. And by way of example, any of you who've done maybe some international travel, especially to a country where perhaps the quality of the water and the food is not so good, you may have taken a typhoid vaccine that was in the form of pills. Any of you who have kids, especially kids who are now much older, we use the oral polio vaccine, which was a few drops of polio chemicals for years and years and years. Now we typically do it in a shot form in this country. And there are also spray vaccines. Now on the market, there's an influenza vaccine that's a nasal spray as opposed to a needle. So multiple different ways. But the bottom line is the goal of these products is to teach our immune system to recognize these agents, these viruses and bacteria, such that when we do encounter them, we can respond very quickly. Now, what is our immune system? I think it's worth giving, just a couple minutes to it. The human immune system is really complex. But the key parts with regard to interacting with the vaccine include these various types of cells that roam around our body, finding and killing or somehow tagging viruses, bacteria, parasites, various invaders, including cancers, actually, and then trying to help our body get rid of them. So for vaccines, there's 3 main cells that really help in that process. The first I'll talk about briefly is macrophages. It's a wonderful Greek term that means big eaters. And macrophages are cells that they kill and digest all sorts of things in our body that we don't want, whether it's cells that have died, our native cells that have died, or a foreign body, a sliver that we got, or a virus or bacteria that we got infected with. And not only do they do that, but they leave behind key parts of those particular viruses or bacteria that the rest of the immune system can recognize and thus fight. And we call those pieces that are left behind antigens, a fancy name for a little piece of a virus or bacteria. Those antigens that are left behind are recognized by other cells in our body. B lymphocytes, you probably heard of those. Those are the cells that make antibodies. So they recognize those little pieces of the virus or the bacteria the antigens that are left behind, and they start to make antibodies against that particular chemical. T lymphocytes also recognize those chemicals, and they're able to attack cells with that information they gained from the antigens, attack cells that have already been infected. So very, very helpful, these three cells. And that's how our immune system uses or interacts with these vaccines to prevent either a severe infection or an infection at all. Now, there's multiple different types of vaccines, and I'll talk about the big four and with some examples of each. On this slide, if you start in the upper left-hand corner, you will see that one way that we use these products and put them into vaccines is, first of all, you can weaken the virus. We certainly don't want to give people the native virus and make them sick. So instead, you can make the virus significantly weaker, and yet it's still a viable virus that you can get a very mild response to. The MMR vaccine, which includes measles, mumps, and rubella, that's what MMR stands for, is an example of a vaccine where the viruses are weakened, but your body is still able to respond to those chemicals, those antigens, and make a response and protect you the next time you're exposed to those viruses. On the upper right-hand corner, you'll see another way that these products are produced is by inactivating the virus completely. So it cannot replicate itself. It cannot produce more virus inside of you, but those key chemicals, those antigens are still present. And we inactivate them typically by chemicals. We have a variety of chemicals, just like you spray some chemical on your countertop to kill viruses and bacteria like Lysol or something else. We have similar chemicals that we use to inactivate viruses or bacteria and then make vaccines out of what remains. In the lower left-hand side, there's another way that vaccines are made, and it's using a specific part of that particular virus or bacteria, or the pathogen, kind of a fancy word. And that particular part oftentimes is a toxin that our body recognizes, like those antigens. You can alter that toxin so it doesn't continue to be toxic to us, and we call those toxoids. They're toxin-like, but they don't hurt us, but they still allow our immune system to respond and create immunity to it the next time we see that virus or bacteria. And then the final type of vaccine that is out there is using the genetic code of the virus or the bacteria. So either RNA or DNA. And you're probably most familiar with this from these messenger RNA vaccines that are used for COVID during the COVID pandemic, in particular the Pfizer vaccine for COVID and the Moderna vaccine for COVID. So those are the four main types of vaccines and a little bit about their production methods. Now, vaccine approval, after we have done some research and realized that we have a problem and something that we'd like to fix, too many cases of polio or measles or some other disease, the basic research is done on creating vaccine candidates. And the trials that are run, we call them phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials for human vaccines, always start with safety. So phase 1 is looking at, is this product safe? Phase 2 is you look at, is the product effective? And then phase 3, you look at the appropriate dosing of the product. Do you give it just once? Do you give it twice? Do you give, let's say, 1 milligram of it or 10 milligrams? And is it both safe and effective? So these products go through these trials, phase 1, 2, 3. And then the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, part of our federal government, has an advisory committee that reviews all of this data along with the staff of the FDA. And they make a recommendation either to proceed with approval or to send the studies back to the vaccine manufacturer and say, we don't have enough data on kids or on the elderly, or we don't have enough data on people who also have another disease like multiple sclerosis. We don't know if this vaccine will work. So that is the main process. That advisory committee at the FDA is called VRBPAC, kind of a long, crazy acronym, but it is the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. I suspect some of you have probably looked up VRBPAC and maybe even follow when vaccines are brought before that advisory committee to see what happened that day at that particular meeting. So if the FDA process is positive, if they say this is a vaccine that we need that will help with human health, and the data shows that it's safe and it's effective, they make a recommendation, and then it goes to the Centers for Disease Control for review on how best to use that vaccine, given the already approved vaccines that are out there and the vaccine dates and times that people typically receive them. How does this new vaccine fit in? The CDC has its advisory committee. It's called ACIP, or the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. Just like VRBPAC, the ACIP is open to the public. You can listen in and hear all the deliberations when these products are coming up for review. And ACIP does its review. These independent researchers and college professors, et cetera, doing this work independently of the CDC, and they make their recommendation to the CDC. And then ultimately, the CDC director, he or she, makes an approval of the particular product, the vaccine. So that's the national level. There's one more step here in Oregon. And just because the feds have said we're going to approve this vaccine doesn't mean every state is going to go ahead and use it. So in Oregon, we have one more process. And after the CDC director has gone ahead and said, yeah, I recommend approval of this vaccine and use as follows, we have a consortium out here in Oregon called the Western States Scientific Safety Review Work Group. And our independent experts review it as well and make a recommendation to the governor whether to accept using this vaccine and rolling it into our existing vaccine use or to not accept it. So that's the overall process. And that's kind of what's going on behind the scenes long before you ever hear about a vaccine for you or your kids or your loved ones. Now, we've had vaccines for years and years and years, began way back in the 1700s in the Western world, and even earlier than that in part of, the Eastern world. And vaccines have been really, really effective for a lot of diseases, certainly not for all diseases, but for many. This is a slide showing the data of the number of reported cases of various viruses and bacteria before we had a vaccine in the United States. And then in the year 2006, how many cases of those conditions did we have in the United States, which is after we had effective vaccines. And you can see some of the big decreases in these diseases that have occurred significantly because of vaccines, not 100%, but mostly because of these vaccines. So for example, when I was a kid, we still had some paralytic polio cases around. I had friends, unfortunately, who were paralyzed due to polio. In a typical year before the vaccine, our country had somewhere between about 15 and 20,000 people every year paralyzed with polio. Since the vaccine has been used readily, we have 0 cases of paralytic polio in this country. It's been decades since we have had a polio case that originated from our country. Occasionally, someone will get it in another country like Afghanistan or Pakistan, 2 countries that currently have polio, and they will come visit our country and then they show up with paralysis, but that is not from our country. It was due to travel here. You can see other diseases. Diphtheria used to be a big scourge in our country and many countries. We don't have diphtheria anymore because we have a great vaccine. When I was a kid, measles regularly killed children. Unfortunately, we had about 500,000 cases a year in this country. We now have very, very sporadic outbreaks of tiny numbers. Instead of 500,000 cases, if we have an outbreak at all, we might have 10, 20, 40 people in that outbreak. And in a given year, the entire country might only have 1,000 or 2,000 cases of measles. If you scroll down to the bottom of this slide, there's the bacteria whooping cough, or the fancy name for it is pertussis. We have vaccines for that as well, a series of 5 vaccines for kids and then a booster in adolescents. Unfortunately, that vaccine's not as great. We have not had 100% reduction in whooping cough. We still get whooping cough outbreaks from time to time. Lane County had one in 2018. Many of you probably remember we had several hundred cases, a lot of hospitalizations too. We fortunately had 0 deaths. But our whooping cough vaccine is anywhere between about 80% to 85% effective. It's not a perfect vaccine. So that's some background on what vaccines have done over the years. And I have a few graphics to show you quickly what it used to look like in the country. On the left-hand side of this graph are measles cases. And you can see the large number of cases we had in this country for measles, again, around 500,000 a year. And then in 1963, we introduced a vaccine. It was an inactivated, so-called dead vaccine for measles. And it really gave a big decrease in measles cases, but it wasn't good enough. We realized that measles does better with a live vaccine. So we introduced a live vaccine and we had a 90% reduction in measles cases within just a few years in this country, which is wonderful. We saved lives, we saved hospitalizations, we saved kids who probably missed out on a month or 2 of school and had to repeat 5th grade, something like that. And then we had a few small outbreaks and we realized the vaccine was good, but not great. So we need a 2-dose series. So in 1989, we recommended 2 doses of the measles vaccine for all children. And we have, as I said before, very few measles cases now. 2-dose vaccine, one of the best vaccines we have, 98% effective after 2 doses at preventing measles, and probably prevents it for life. You don't ever need a booster, which is great. Next to that curve for measles is the polio curve. And polio has always been episodic. It goes up and down. Our country had a terrible, terrible polio outbreak in 1916. That's a long time ago, but in New York City alone, a couple thousand people died, a terrible, terrible outbreak. And then over the ensuing decades, it went up and down and up and down. But then in the late 40s and 50s, it started to escalate again. And that really pushed our country forward to develop polio vaccines, the Sabin vaccine and the Salk vaccine. Movies have been made about that. You probably have seen them. And as soon as we got those vaccines, we had a massive decrease in polio. And as I said, now we have no native polio in our country at all, thanks to everybody getting the polio vaccine. Unfortunately, there are, I think now 12 countries that have polio. So it's no more than a flight away from us, and it could be reintroduced anytime. So if people are unvaccinated and it does get reintroduced, they could be at risk. 2 more that I want to share that are sort of historical. This is diphtheria. This is the graph for diphtheria, number of cases in our country. And then on the bottom, it goes year by year. The diphtheria toxoid vaccine, again, one of those toxins that was made less toxic and then put into a vaccine. So our body recognizes the chemical and can fight off diphtheria, but doesn't suffer the consequences of the toxin. That vaccine was introduced in 1923. Improved over the years, and 100% decrease in diphtheria. No cases of diphtheria in our country for several decades. The last one of historical significance, again, is whooping cough. Whooping cough is episodic. Usually every 3 to 5 years, we get an outbreak. As I mentioned, Lane County had an outbreak in 2018. We have now entered our risk period again, where we might get a whooping cough outbreak sometime soon. But you can see how well the whooping cough vaccine has worked, decreasing cases from a couple 100,000 a year down to 500, 800, 1,000 per year in any given year, which is wonderful. Now, all of these successes of vaccines, they occurred before I was a practicing physician. This last graph occurred, and really, I kind of lived through this. So there's a bacteria called Haemophilus influenza B. It's not related to the influenza virus. It just causes a similar condition, so it got that name. And this bacteria is lethal to babies. And when I was training in the 1980s, we had special protocols. Anytime an infant had a fever, you had to be worried, really, of Haemophilus, this bacteria. And sadly, we had kids die repeatedly from this bacterial infection. And then in the early 1990s, we had a vaccine that was introduced that was very effective and was given to kids 2 months or more. And now we have almost 0 cases of this in kids throughout the country. Really effective vaccine. Now, all of that is probably interesting and historically known to you and some, and maybe some is new. But of course, vaccines are not perfect. Really, nothing in medicine is perfect. Vaccines have effects and they have side effects. I suspect many of you are familiar with the local effects. Anytime you put a needle in your skin, it can hurt. Just like when you get a sliver, it hurts at the site where the sliver went into your foot or your finger. It's the same with a needle. You can also get swelling, you get redness at the site of the injection, and those are expected normal local effects that humans get from injected vaccines. There are also what we call systemic effects. Those are effects that are not just at the site where the needle went in, but they are throughout your body, perhaps. And that is your body recognizing the chemicals, the so-called antigens that are in that vaccine and responding to them. And those are the symptoms that you get on occasion from a vaccine, just like you get when you get the infection. You could have a fever, you could be tired, sometimes muscle aches and joint pain, sometimes a headache. So those are just side effects that, or those are effects that we expect from vaccines. Now, beyond those expected effects, there are side effects that we don't want to have. And I'm going to spend more of my time now on this particular issue. First, I think worth noting is allergic reactions. And we care about all the allergic reactions, and we're most worried about the severe allergic reactions where somebody has a reaction as if they were allergic to peanuts and they unfortunately ate a peanut. They can have a life-threatening reaction. And that does happen on occasion from vaccines. We learned some time ago, for example, that some people are allergic to latex. And if they are around latex, even latex balloons, latex gloves, the latex in the rubber stopper of a vaccine syringe, they can have life-threatening reactions. So, for example, the new COVID vaccines, none of them have latex in their rubber stoppers because we want to make sure people don't get exposed to that. But there are other ways you can have a severe allergic reaction. It can be to something else in the vaccine manufacture, can be some other chemical that's part of the virus or bacteria itself. And these are heavily monitored, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Other side effects, something we call the anatomic effect. There are specific places, if it's going to be an injectable vaccine, where we put the needle. Many of you have probably had a vaccine in your shoulder, your deltoid muscle. We know the anatomy. We know where the arteries and veins and nerves are in that part of the body. And we know we can put a needle in a certain part of your shoulder, your deltoid muscle, and we're not going to hit any nerves. Unfortunately, on occasion, people have weird anatomy. Maybe it was moved by an accident or surgery, and on occasion, a nerve can be hit with the needle. Or what happens much more commonly than someone having unusual anatomy is if you're giving a vaccine to a child and that child is rambunctious and moving all over the place, either you don't give the vaccine or you try, and sometimes the kid moves at the last second and you can have a challenge. These are rare, but they happen on occasion. So that sort of anatomic side effect. And then there are these side effects that are part of the vaccine itself. So for example, I suspect many of you have heard about the COVID messenger RNA vaccines that can cause this inflammation of the heart muscle in adolescents at a rate of 1 per a few 100,000. It's mostly in boys. It's mostly after with the second dose. And one of the ways that that has been mitigated now is we realize we don't have to give the Pfizer second dose 3 weeks after the first, which is what we did for the first 6 months or 8 months of the time we were using the vaccine. You can stretch it out a few more weeks, and that markedly decreases the risk of this inflammation to the heart in adolescents. So recommendation now is try to give it at about 8 weeks instead, and that will decrease the risk. So these side effects or these injuries are reported in many different ways. And I'm going to talk now about the ways they are reported and how we use those reports to try to make things safer. In this country, we have 4 main systems that allow us to get data on vaccines. And I'm going to speak briefly about each one. VSafe, the Vares system, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, and then the CISA system. And let's just start with the VSafe, because that's the one that probably most of you have heard about because it's most recent. With the COVID vaccines, this new smartphone-based surveillance system was put in place. I'm hoping many of you chose to use this after you or your loved one was vaccinated. And on the screen, you can see what pops up on a smartphone. When you register, you will get pinged every day via your smartphone. How are you doing today? Any symptoms? What are your symptoms? And each screen, you'll type in what you're feeling. And then the surveillance system will go on every other week, and then after a couple months, and then it will stop. And that was really helpful to us to assess the safety of these vaccines, these new COVID vaccines during a pandemic. Typically, we take a few years to gather this data, but with a pandemic, you don't have the luxury of time like that when people are dying. So VSafe was a really nice system that allowed millions of people to interact and give us data much more quickly than we might otherwise have received that data. Next up is VAERS. This is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. This has been around for decades. I suspect some of you have put in side effects or potential injuries that you or a loved one may have incurred from a vaccine. VAERS is open to everyone. My mother has put reports into VAERS. I've had corpsmen when I was in the Navy put it into VAERS. I know neighbors who've done it. They thought that there was something that we should all know, and it was shared. And I encourage everybody to use VAERS. It's out there, readily available to anyone. You can just Google it or go to the web browser of your choice and take a look at it. You can also look at the data too. Now, VAERS isn't perfect. one of the challenges, of course, is because anybody can put it in there. The quality of the data is not always perfect. It's not medical data. It's not nurses and doctors. It's, moms and dads and aunts and uncles and other people who may not have all of the scientific knowledge, but they have an issue that we should learn from. So that's an issue. It's also limited because of biases. Everybody has bias, and sometimes biases creep in. And also, we can't determine cause and effect. If you look any given day at the Vares system, you might see 25, 30,000 reports in there. The vast majority of them are swelling, redness at the site of the needle, just like, as I said, with a sliver or a paper cut or something else. And you don't really know, is it directly related to the vaccine, or is it some other injury, or is it some other condition that the other person might have had? They might have had lupus, they might have had rheumatoid arthritis that can also cause those types of problems. And how do those interplay? But there are a lot of strengths with the Vares system. People can put in information right away, so we can rapidly detect any potential problems. And we can also detect rare problems because thousands of people can put in their data after a vaccine. So Vares has been around for a long time, and we're very thankful that people use it and put their data in. And I encourage you to do the same should you or any of your family members get a vaccine in the future. So to answer some of the questions of Vares, there's the Vaccine Safety Data Link. This is a group of participating healthcare organizations, like on the West Coast, the Kaiser Permanente system, with millions of patients. So you get Vares people, and they give a report of a vaccine problem. And if we're seeing those reports in the Vaccine Safety Data Link, we also get medical record report, we get doctor's notes, we get a lot of medical information as well that combined can help us better understand, number one, what is the issue? Number two, is it completely related to the vaccine or not related to the vaccine at all, or somewhere in between? And that is very, very helpful. So Vares has all sorts of information in it, not just the health records and outpatient visits, but it has emergency room data, has birth certificate data, basically a lot of surveillance system data pulled together so we can really understand the problem, the level of the problem, and how it's related to the vaccine. And also get some idea about what to do with that data. Do you stop the vaccine being used at all? Or do you change the type of system that it's given under, or the dates and times it's given? Like I said earlier with the myocarditis issue in adolescents and the COVID vaccines, just delay the second dose a few weeks and the risk drops, significantly. So there are benefits to this system of the Vaccine Safety Data Link, and they are the depth of knowledge, combining the medical information along with the report, and the ability to really do some cause and effect analysis, because now we have better data to really help us understand, which is a wonderful thing. Taking that step one step further is the CISA project. It's the Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment. It allows people like me and nurses and such to get clinical consults about potential vaccine injuries. We use this system pretty regularly in the healthcare space. We call up and say, I saw this. What are you seeing across the country? Give us an idea, and we can get almost real time. Every day we can have a conversation with people part of this project for the Center for Disease Control. And also, it allows us to come up with research questions. If there is this response to a vaccine, what are the parts of the vaccine or parts of the apparatus the vaccine is given, like I talked about latex and the rubber stoppers, that may have caused the problem, and how can we fix it? So all of these systems together help ensure the safety of vaccines in the United States. They're not perfect, but they're very, very helpful. And we're very thankful that they're there. So I'm going to finish here with frequently asked questions, as I promised you I would. These are probably the top 5 questions we get at the health department around various vaccines, and I'll just take them one by one. The first question is, don't you get the flu from the flu vaccine? We hear that a lot every season, especially in the fall when the flu vaccines come out and we're trying to protect the community, especially high-risk people like the elderly, from what we know is going to be the only reliable epidemic we have every year, which is influenza. And the truth of the matter is, until just a few years ago, there were no live flu vaccines at all. So you could never get influenza from the flu vaccine because it was an inactivated vaccine. A few years ago, we got one of those nasal spray flu vaccines that's actually a live, altered, weakened flu virus. For decades, you could say, no, you can't get the flu from the vaccine. Now you can say, well, there's one vaccine out there for influenza. It's the nasal spray vaccine. It's a weakened virus, and it does not replicate outside of cooler areas like your nose. So technically, you really don't get the flu because it doesn't go down into your lungs. It doesn't go throughout your body. But you do have a minor infection for a short period of time that your body recognizes and then builds up immunity to. So the next time you see influenza, you won't get infected. Next question, isn't it better to just get the infection than to get a vaccine? We hear that one pretty regularly too. And you know, if some of these infections were as mild as the common cold, you know, there'd be some agreement with that. Gosh, many of these infections have no severe effects. They're an annoyance more than anything else. Runny nose, scratchy throat, itchy eyes, maybe a low-grade fever, a little bit of fatigue. But the viruses and bacteria we've made vaccines for cause significant problems for generations of people on this planet. I myself have seen kids die from Haemophilus. I mentioned the Hib vaccine. I've done a lot of international work with measles. There's still measles in sub-Saharan Africa. I've unfortunately seen people die from measles. Measles is a nasty, nasty infection. It's the #1 cause of blindness on this planet. And we don't see that in America because of how good the measles vaccine is. But in general, you don't want to get many of these infections. It's much safer to get a vaccine. The third question is, doesn't the mercury preservative in vaccines cause autism? I think many people might be familiar with the medical article in the journal The Lancet back in 1998, saying that one particular vaccine might increase the risk of autism. You might not be familiar what happened over a couple of years after that time, where it was realized that the data was fraudulent, and that article was retracted from the medical journal. And then ultimately, the lead author on that article was found to have not been ethical and lied about several things. And he was a physician. He was stripped of his license in the United Kingdom where he practiced. And yet, because the word has gotten out into the social media, into the ether, as they say, it continues to circulate that, you know, vaccines cause autism. In particular, one of these preservatives, the mercury preservative. And we just don't have any studies that show that that's true. There's been lots of studies looking at it. The state of California almost 20 years ago said, well, okay, if there's a possibility that this preservative negatively impacts children, especially their neurological development might cause autism, let's just have a state law. You have to get rid of all mercury preservative in children and pregnant moms' vaccines. And the state did that. And yet the number of cases of autism in California didn't change at all over the last almost 20 years. So the answer to that question is no. And a lot of data says that that is not correct. Two more questions and then I'll stop for the Q&A session. Why should my children get these vaccines when I don't know anyone with the diseases the vaccines protect against? And we get that question quite a bit, maybe a little bit less than we have over the last few years, but I've heard it for years in my career. And really, there's a couple points I want to make here. The first is some of our vaccines have been so good, and you have seen we've eliminated smallpox from this planet. Many of you watching or listening today didn't have to get a smallpox vaccine, as I did as a child, because smallpox doesn't exist anymore, because vaccination eliminated it across the planet. We've eliminated polio in this country. We've eliminated diphtheria because of vaccines. So vaccines have really been, the effectiveness of vaccines has really helped people to understand that, gosh, these things don't exist anymore. Why do I need to get a vaccine? And one of the reasons, of course, is many of these are still just a plane ride away from you. And if you're not protected, when we have international events and people coming into our country, you could get exposed. So that's one big reason. The other reason is that, again, no vaccines are perfect. I showed you some of the vaccines that are great, but not every vaccine is 100% effective. We wish they were, but they're not. So even if you are vaccinated, you may get infected, but if you're not vaccinated, your risk is even higher. So please consider that. And then finally, I thought vaccines were only for babies. Do adults need vaccines? And I have to say, before I went to medical school, I probably thought that that was the case too. I grew up, I'm now 25 years old, and I'm done with vaccines. The fact of the matter is there are still vaccine preventable diseases that can really hurt adults. And a common one, there's a bacteria that's the #1 cause of pneumonia in adults. It's called Streptococcus pneumoniae, and we have a vaccine against it. One of them is called Pneumovax. Another one's called Prevnar, and they prevent that terrible pneumonia that especially happens in older people and puts them in the hospital, puts them on a ventilator. And of course, there's other vaccines like the flu vaccine as well for adults. So no, they're not just for babies. There are many more vaccines for babies and children because their immune system has seen nothing yet. And some of those terrible diseases are still out there. But yes, adults still need to get some vaccines, or they're still recommended for them. So Leah, I'm going to stop there and happy to pitch it back to you to proceed as you wish.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. I have 3 questions, and then hopefully we'll get some questions from the audience. Which vaccines, and if you don't know the answer, that's fine. Which vaccines do we see the most injury complaints from? Do you know?
Well, so the first cut would usually be those vaccines that are injectable, because that includes the possibility of, hitting a nerve or something like that. In terms of the number of complaints, it changes over time as the formulation has changed. So in my practice career, we used to use a whooping cough vaccine that was a whole cell vaccine. It was the whole bacteria that then was inactivated, and we used the whole bacteria. So it had a lot more antigens. And we had a fair number of parents saying, my kid is not quite right, or maybe they even had a seizure. So over the years, we changed it to an acellular pertussis, acellular whooping cough vaccine, and that's what we use now. So it changes, over time, back and forth, depending upon what we learn and how the vaccine has been changed to have less, what's the right word? Less side effects, I think. So that's the biggest, those are the 2 biggest points for me, I think, that are probably worth sharing.
What is the most likely vaccine injury? And I think you talked about that briefly, but.
Yeah, I think it's still persons who get an injectable vaccine and it involves something at that site. So even though it's really, really uncommon, 1 in hundreds of thousands or a million, some kind of anatomic injury. And that can also include occasionally not very good screening of the patient. Somebody has hemophilia. They have this bleeding syndrome, and they get a shot and they continue to bleed, and they bleed into their muscle, they bleed into the fascia tissue, and that's a problem. Your body doesn't like blood where it doesn't belong, and it takes a long time for that to go away. So I think that's, in my experience doing this 40 years roughly, I think those are the key points for me.
When I was doing my research for the vaccine exhibit at the S&J House, I saw that there was a number of injuries in 2017, 2018, in that time period, arm injuries, and they figured out it was the wrong needle that was being used, and they had to change the size of the needle. And so, sometimes it isn't even the vaccine itself. It's, it's the equipment being used. Like you said, you mentioned the latex. And so that really does play into it. And our anatomy plays into it. And are injuries more likely in children or adults?
Children is, if you look at Vares especially, it's more children than adults. And, as a medical epidemiologist, you have to sit back and say, well, if you were to calculate a rate, so number of doses given per number of side effects, they might be equal. I don't know off the top of my head, but because kids get a lot more vaccines than adults do, but it's typically more in kids. And there's another reason for that as well. Adults, there's just more of us. So, we have, I don't mean in terms of number, I mean in terms of size. Our muscles are bigger, we have more storage fat. So even if we were to use the wrong size needle, right? If we use a needle too long, we're not going to hit the bone because we have more muscle mass and more fat. So it's little ones, most commonly little ones, little kids.
And that's because of their anatomy mostly.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, in fact, you know, I suspect none of the adults on this call remember ever getting a vaccine in their upper outer thigh. You know, little kids, right? You know, a 4-month-old baby, they don't have much of a deltoid at all, but they do have their quadriceps muscles, right? They have thigh muscles, and they also have, you know, that pudgy, really cute baby fat. So we give a fair number of vaccines, you know, in the upper outer thigh in little ones, because that's where there's the least risk, because there's so much tissue there. So you don't do, you focus the vaccine on the lowest risk area if the vaccine is recommended at all. You know, sometimes the risk doesn't recommend a vaccine. So I'll give you an example of that. I alluded to the fact that I was in the military. My first career, I was a Navy physician. And we get several vaccines in the military that the rest of society don't get. So one of the very common cold viruses is called the adenovirus. We've all had it probably many times in our lives, and, you know, a runny nose, itchy eyes, you know, you feel kind of bad for a while, and that doesn't do much to the rest of us. But if you're on a Navy ship and 75% of your crew has that virus, you can't fight the enemy. So I got the adenovirus like everybody else in the military, because the risk is higher in the barracks, on a ship, you know, on a big airplane. So it's really about risk benefit ratio. There's lots of vaccines that just don't make sense to give to the general population, so we don't recommend them.
And that that really feeds into, you know, a lot of the questions I saw when I was doing the research around why are there so many and why do we have to get them all, and you know, there are some that we don't get and not everybody gets, and
Yes,
if you don't
indeed.
travel, there's a whole bunch you don't get, and things like that.
And, you know, I would also say that I remember the first report in the medical literature in journals about HIV, the HIV virus. You know, we didn't have a name for it in 1981, but that was the first report. And don't we wish we had an effective vaccine against HIV in 1981? You know, we still don't, even today. More than 40 years later, we still don't. It's just, so even though there are some conditions the risk benefit doesn't recommend us getting a vaccine, I think there are others where we sure wish we had an effective vaccine, and we've been suffering as a human race because we don't.
Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. I think your presentation was very thorough. I thank you for answering my questions, and I really appreciate your time. This is a topic that is so hard to discuss for a lot of people because it's very emotional. And I appreciate your very thorough presentation about the topic. And I want to say thank you to the Lane County Cultural Coalition and Oregon Cultural Trust for the funding for this presentation, and my partner NAACP for helping with this presentation as well. And thank you very much, Dr. Luedtke, for your time and your great information. Getting lots of great feedback on Facebook for your presentation here. So I very much appreciate it, and you'll be hearing from me very soon.
Thank you much. It was a pleasure working with you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody.